The wind in Wyoming had a language all its own. It spoke of endings. It hissed through the skeletal branches of cottonwood trees, moaned across the vast, empty plains, and whispered secrets to the bleached bones of cattle half buried in the thawing mud. For Luke Carson, it was a constant, mournful companion, the only voice that had answered him for months. The winter had been a brutal one, a fist of ice that had clenched around his small ranch and squeezed. It had taken 10 head of cattle, freezing them where they stood, their eyes wide with a final, glassy surprise. It had taken the last of his grain, leaving the silo echoing and hollow. And it had taken Martha. He'd buried her himself, just as the ground began to soften from stone to stubborn clay. The fever had come on fast, a fire in her blood that all the cool rags and willow bark tea couldn't quench. He'd held her hand as she'd faded, her breath growing shallow until it was just another sigh lost to the relentless wind. He'd built the coffin from the last of the good pine boards, his hammer strokes echoing in the profound silence of their small cabin. He dug the grave on the little rise overlooking the creek, the spot she'd always loved, his shovel biting into the earth with grunts of exertion and grief. There was no preacher, no ceremony, just him, a rough-hewn cross, and the wind, which seemed to keen and cry as he shoveled the dark, cold earth back into place. Now, spring was a hesitant, reluctant visitor. Patches of pale green fought their way through the brown expanse, and the sun offered a weak, watery warmth that did little to touch the chill deep in his bones. The ranch was a testament to his loss. The silence in the cabin was a physical weight. Martha's rocking chair sat still by the hearth, her sewing basket, a needle still threaded through a piece of gingham, gathered dust on the mantel. Luke moved through the space like a ghost. His world shrunk to the rhythm of relentless, meaningless chores: mend the fence, clear the fallen branches, muck out the barn. He worked until his muscles screamed and his mind was numb, because exhaustion was the only solace he could find. Sleep offered no peace, only dreams of Martha's feverish eyes and the hollow space in the bed beside him. He was a man pared down to his essence: grit, grief, and a loneliness so vast it mirrored the plains outside his door. He was 35 but felt 100. The land had etched itself onto his face, in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built for labor, with hands that were calloused and capable, hands that had built this home and buried his wife. One evening, as a sliver of a moon rose in the bruised twilight sky, he was searching for a bottle of whiskey he'd stashed away. His hand, fumbling behind a stack of old almanacs in a dusty crate, brushed against a piece of paper. He pulled it out. The paper was creased and slightly stained. The ink faded in places. It was an application form for a mail-order bride service, based out of a St. Louis Gazette. He stared at it, the memory returning like a sour taste in his mouth. It had been 6 months ago, in the dead of winter, with a blizzard howling outside and Martha's coughing already beginning to sound like splintering wood. He'd been drunk, a rare indulgence, but the cold and the fear had driven him to it. The whiskey had loosened something in him, a desperate, pathetic hope. He'd seen the advertisement in a newspaper someone had left in town. Honest, hard-working men of the West seek respectable women for matrimony. Banish the loneliness of the frontier. In a haze of alcohol and despair, he had filled it out. His handwriting was a barely legible scrawl. Name, Luke Carson. Age, 35. Widower. No. He'd written that before the winter had truly shown its teeth. Profession, rancher. Property, 160 acres. Small cabin, barn. Temperament, sober. Hard-working. Requirements for a wife: strong constitution. Willing to work. Honest. He'd sealed it with a drop of candle wax and, on his next trip to town for supplies, had mailed it, feeling a hot flush of shame even as he dropped it into the slot. He'd forgotten about it almost immediately, the act buried under the avalanche of the ensuing months. Seeing it now felt like looking at the foolish ramblings of a stranger. He hadn't expected a reply then, and he certainly didn't expect one now. He was a man with a broken ranch and a fresh grave on his land. What woman would choose this? What woman would choose a life tethered to a man hollowed out by grief? He crumpled the paper in his fist, the sound loud in the quiet room, and tossed it toward the cold hearth. It was the last foolish ember of a hope he no longer possessed. And so, he expected nothing. He watched the days bleed into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. The prairie stirred with new life, but he felt none of it. He was a man locked in his own winter. Until the day they came. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The days had lost their names. The air was still, holding the scent of damp earth and the promise of rain. Luke was splitting wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe, the only sound besides his own breathing. When he saw the wagon, it wasn't the mail coach, which was due in 2 days. This was a simple buckboard, hired from the settlement 2 days' ride east. It trundled slowly up the long, rutted track to his ranch, and as it drew closer, he could see 2 figures on the seat. The driver, a local man named Silas, and a woman. Luke lowered his axe, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. His first thought was that someone had come with news, or perhaps a lost traveler seeking shelter. The woman was a silhouette against the bright sky, wearing a plain bonnet and a dark traveling dress. As the wagon creaked to a halt near the porch, she climbed down. She moved with a purpose that spoke of a long, weary journey finally at its end. She was older than he'd expected a woman traveling alone to be, perhaps 30. Her face was framed by the bonnet, revealing strong cheekbones and a dusting of freckles across her nose. Her skin was tanned by the sun, not the pale, porcelain complexion of the women back east he remembered from his youth. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a deep, steady brown, and they held a knowledge of hardship that he recognized instantly. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things, endured things. "Mr. Luke Carson?" she asked. Her voice was steady, with a soft southern cadence that had been flattened by time and travel. He nodded, his own voice rusty from disuse. "Ma'am, my name is June Abernathy." She held out a gloved hand, then seemed to think better of it and let it drop to her side. "I believe you were expecting me." The words hung in the air between them. Expecting me. His mind went blank, then raced back to the crumpled piece of paper in the hearth. The mail-order bride. It was impossible. A cruel, cosmic joke. He'd sent that letter half a year ago. Before he could form a reply, before he could process the sheer improbability of it all, another sound reached him. It was the jangle of harnesses and the rumble of wheels. Louder this time, more insistent. He turned his head, his gaze following the track back toward the main trail. The weekly mail coach, 2 days early, was cresting the rise, its horses kicking up a cloud of dust. It, too, was heading directly for his ranch. Silas, the buckboard driver, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, looking from the approaching coach to Luke's stunned face. "Looks like you're popular today, Carson." The coach pulled up a short distance from the buckboard, the driver reining in the horses with a loud, "Whoa!" The door swung open, and another woman descended the steps. This one was younger, perhaps 24 or 25. Where June was angles and weathered strength, this woman was softness and curves. Her skin was pale, as if she had spent her life indoors, and a few strands of light brown hair had escaped her bonnet to curl around her face. Her blue eyes were wide and uncertain, darting from the rough-hewn cabin to the silent man with the axe, to the other woman standing by the porch as if she owned the place. She clutched a small carpet bag to her chest like a shield. "Is this the Carson Ranch?" she asked, her voice soft and cultured, the clipped vowels of the East a stark contrast to June's drawl. Luke could only manage another dumb nod. I am Clara Bishop. She took a hesitant step forward, her gaze fixed on him. I've come in response to your letter. Silence. The world seemed to stop. The wind died down. The horses stamped their feet and snorted, their breath misting in the cool air. Luke stood frozen between them, the axe handle slick in his palm. 2 women, 2 mail-order brides, both standing before his gate, both looking at him with a mixture of hope and trepidation, both having crossed half a continent based on the drunken, desperate scrawl of a man who had since buried his wife and his heart. He felt a surge of panic, hot and suffocating. He wanted to tell them there had been a mistake, a terrible mistake. He wanted to tell them to get back in their respective wagons and go, to leave him to his grief and his silence. But he looked at their faces. He saw the exhaustion etched around June's steady eyes and the quiet desperation shimmering in Clara's gaze. He saw the worn hems of their dresses, the dust of a long journey clinging to their shoulders. They had come all this way. They had sold what they had, packed what they could, and pinned their last hopes on him. He couldn't turn them away. Not like this, not out here, with nowhere for them to go. His voice, when it finally came, was a low rasp. You both better come inside. The cabin, which had once felt so empty, was now impossibly crowded. The 2 women stood near the door, their bags at their feet, taking in the Spartan interior, the stone hearth, the rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, the single bed in the corner, the ladder leading to a small loft. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old leather, and a tension so palpable it felt like another person in the room. Luke gestured vaguely toward the chairs. Please, sit. June moved first, her posture straight and composed as she sat. Clara followed, perching on the edge of her chair as if ready to flee at any moment. Luke remained standing, feeling like a cornered animal in his own home. He needed to say something, to explain the colossal, tragic error that had brought them here. He cleared his throat. There's been a misunderstanding. June's gaze met his, unwavering. Oh, I don't think so. Mr. Carson, your letter was quite clear. You were seeking a wife. I wrote that letter 6 months ago, he said, the words feeling heavy and useless. My wife, Martha, she was still alive then. She was sick, but she was alive. He looked toward the small, unadorned window that faced the hill. She passed during the winter. A flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or just understanding, crossed June's face. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, her blue eyes widening with shock and sympathy. Oh, you poor man, she whispered. We are so sorry. We wouldn't have come if we had known. That's just it, Luke said, running a hand through his hair. I never expected a reply, not after so long, and certainly not, he trailed off, unable to say it. Certainly not 2 of you. It was June who broke the silence, her practical nature taking over. Well, we are here now, Mr. Carson, and the coach won't be back for a week. She looked over at Clara, a hint of appraisal in her eyes. It seems you have a decision to make. The word hung in the air. Decision. He was supposed to choose between them, as if they were 2 heads of cattle at a market, to inspect them, weigh their merits, and send one on her way. The thought was galling. Before I make any kind of decision, he said, his voice firm, I need to understand who I'm talking to. The letters, they don't say much. June nodded slowly. She folded her hands in her lap, her back straight as a fence post. My husband, Samuel, died at Gettysburg. I was a nurse during the war. I saw more death than any woman ought to. Her gaze was distant for a moment, seeing things he couldn't imagine. When the war was over, I went back to his family's farm in Georgia, but they didn't approve of my work. They said tending to wounded men who weren't my husband, was unclean. His mother said I had shamed his memory. The words were delivered without a trace of self-pity. A simple statement of fact. There was nothing for me there. They turned me out with little more than the clothes on my back. I saw your advertisement. I'm strong. I'm not afraid of work. And I know how to make a home from nothing. That's my story. Mr. Carson. Luke listened, a knot tightening in his stomach. He'd heard stories of the war, of the bitterness that followed. To be cast out for trying to heal people, it spoke of a cruelty he couldn't fathom. He looked at her hands, resting in her lap. They weren't delicate, but they were skilled. He could imagine them setting a bone or soothing a fevered brow. Then he turned his attention to Clara. She flinched under his gaze, her eyes dropping to the floor. She seemed to shrink into herself. "Miss Bishop," he prompted gently. She took a shaky breath. Her voice was barely a whisper. "My story is less honorable." She twisted the fabric of her dress in her hands. "I was a teacher. Back in Pennsylvania, I was betrothed." The word came out choked. "My fiancé. He was a respectable man, the son of the town banker. We were to be married in the spring." She paused, struggling for the words. "I found myself in a delicate condition before the wedding." The unspoken truth filled the small cabin. Luke said nothing, waiting. "He refused to marry me. His family said I had tried to trap him, that I was a woman of loose morals, my own family." A single tear traced a path down her pale cheek, and she wiped it away angrily. "They are devout churchgoers. The shame was too much for them to bear. They disowned me." She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with a desperate, pleading honesty. "The baby, a little girl. She was born early. She didn't survive." The whisper was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "There was no place for me, no home, no family, no reputation. I had nothing left. Your advertisement. It was a chance to start over. Somewhere no one knew my name. Somewhere I could be useful." The cabin was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was filled with the ghosts of their pasts, with the pain of rejection and the weight of shame. June, the capable widow deemed unclean. Clara, the gentle teacher branded a sinner. Both cast out, both seeking refuge in this barren place with a man they didn't know. Luke felt something shift inside him. The panic receded, replaced by a profound, aching empathy. He was a man defined by his loss. They were women defined by what had been taken from them. They were all broken. How could he possibly choose one shard of a shattered pot over another? How could he look at either of these women, who had suffered so much, and tell her she wasn't worthy? That she had to go back to the world that had so cruelly rejected her? He couldn't. He let out a long, slow breath. "The coach won't be back for a week," he stated, echoing June's earlier words. "The loft is small, but it's dry. You can both stay, for a few days, until we can figure something out." It wasn't a decision. It was a stay of execution, a desperate bid for time he didn't know how to use. "You'll be safe here." For the first time, a flicker of relief eased the tension in Clara's face. June simply gave him a small, solemn nod, her eyes searching his as if trying to gauge the true measure of the man before her. The days that followed were a strange dance of unspoken rules and careful distances. The women shared the loft, a small, cramped space under the eaves, while Luke slept on the bed below. The cabin, once his solitary refuge, was now filled with the soft rustle of their skirts, the low murmur of their voices, and the scents of soap and lavender mixed with the familiar smell of wood smoke. They were, as they had promised, workers. June rose with him at dawn, her face set with determination. She moved with an economy of motion he recognized from his own hard life. She learned to milk the one remaining cow without him having to show her twice. She mucked out the horse stalls, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, not flinching from the grime. She had a quiet way with the animals, a firm but gentle touch. He found himself watching her, impressed by her resilience. She wasn't just willing to work. She knew how. Clara, in contrast, transformed the cabin. Where there had been dust, there was now a clean-swept floor. A stew bubbled on the hearth in the evenings, filling the small space with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She found Martha's old sewing basket and, with quiet reverence, began mending Luke's torn shirts, her stitches small and perfect. She had a knack for making things comfortable, for turning a house into a home. She would hum softly to herself as she worked, a sound so foreign and yet so welcome that it made Luke's heart ache. He worked alongside them, caught in the middle of their silent, competing offerings of competence and comfort. He and June would work in the fields, clearing rocks or mending fences, often in a companionable silence broken only by the sounds of their labor. With Clara, the moments were indoors, passing her a bucket of water or accepting a plate of warm bread, their fingers brushing in a way that sent a jolt through him, a spark of life he hadn't felt in a year. He was a man starving, and two women had arrived offering two different kinds of nourishment. He found himself needing both, and the realization filled him with a profound and terrible guilt. He felt greedy, monstrous. He was dishonoring Martha's memory by feeling this flicker of life, this pull toward these two strangers. Yet, he could not bring himself to extinguish it. As the week drew to a close, a fragile, unspoken truce had settled over the ranch. The question of his decision hung in the air, but no one dared to voice it. They were three people in a delicate orbit around each other, held together by circumstance and a shared, unspoken loneliness. One evening, they sat on the porch as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the vast, empty landscape in hues of orange, pink, and deep violet. The day's work was done. The air was cool and clean. The wind, for once, was just a gentle whisper, rustling the new leaves on the cottonwoods. No one spoke. They simply watched the sky perform its evening ritual. Luke sat on the top step, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that was more than physical. June leaned against a porch post, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if she could see all the way back to Georgia. Clara sat in Martha's old rocking chair, which she had brought out from the cabin, her hands lying still in her lap. Luke looked at them, their faces softened by the twilight. He saw the strength in June's profile and the gentle curve of Clara's cheek. He saw the ghosts they carried, the pain they tried so hard to hide, and in their shared silence, in the vast, lonely beauty of the Wyoming sunset, he felt a strange and powerful connection to them both. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was something deeper, something more elemental. It was recognition. He saw his own brokenness reflected in their eyes. The wind sighed through the tall grass, a mournful, lonely sound. The first star appeared in the darkening sky. An unspoken question passed between them in the fading light. A glance, a held breath, a feeling that something was beginning here, on this desolate patch of earth, something terrifying and fragile and utterly outside the bounds of any world they had ever known. And not a single one of them knew what to do about it. The week that the mail coach was due came and went. No one spoke of it. The wagon did not stop. A silent, collective breath was held and then released. And a new, unspoken chapter began. The arrangement, born of necessity and Luke's inability to make an impossible choice, solidified into a routine. It was a rhythm of three, a strange and delicate ecosystem taking root in the harsh Wyoming soil. June claimed the outdoors as her domain. She had a farmer's blood in her, a knowledge of the land that was instinctual. She rose with the sun, pulling on a pair of Luke's old trousers she'd altered for herself, and met him at the barn before the morning chill had fully lifted. She learned the heft of the pitchfork, the particular way to scatter grain for the chickens, the low, calming murmur that soothed the horses. She was not a woman who offered comfort through words. She offered it through shared labor, through a steadfast, reliable presence that eased Luke's burden in a way he hadn't realized it could be eased. Their world was the barn, a cathedral of rough-hewn timber, smelling of hay, sweat, and warm animals. Here, they developed a language that required no words. It was in the way he'd pass her a curry comb without looking, his hand knowing exactly where hers would be. It was in the shared glance over the back of a horse, a flicker of mutual understanding in the dim, dusty light. It was in the cadence of their work, the scrape of her shovel answering the thud of his hammer, a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. There were moments, charged and still, that shimmered in the air between them. One afternoon, while mending a broken stall door, he was holding a heavy plank in place while she hammered the nails. She stood close, her arm brushing his with each swing. He could feel the heat of her, smell the clean scent of sweat and soap. He watched the muscles in her forearm tense, the focus in her brown eyes. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts with the effort, and he found he was holding his own. The world shrank to that small space, to the scent of sawdust, the ringing of the hammer, and the profound, electric awareness of her body next to his. When the final nail was driven home, she stepped back, and the spell was broken. But the echo of it, the ghost of her touch and the memory of her breathing, lingered on his skin long after. Another time, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in, a black-bellied beast that unleashed a torrent of rain. They were caught in the hayloft, having just finished stacking the last of the winter feed. They stood by the open loft door, watching the rain lash the earth, the world outside a blur of gray. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and wet dirt. "My father always said a storm was God clearing his throat," June said, her voice low. It was the most personal thing she had offered in weeks. "Mine just said it was a damn nuisance," Luke replied, a small smile touching his lips. They stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, close but not touching. The proximity was a living thing. He was intensely aware of the rise and fall of her chest, the stray wisp of damp hair clinging to her temple. He had the sudden, powerful urge to reach out, to tuck it behind her ear, to feel the texture of her skin. The impulse was so strong his fingers actually twitched at his side. He clenched his hand into a fist, the knuckles white, and stared out at the rain, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't know what it was he felt for this strong, quiet woman, but it was potent and real, a current of energy that flowed between them in the charged, close air of the loft. He was a man drowning in silence, and her silence, somehow, was a lifeline. If June's presence was a steady, grounding force, Clara's was a gentle, insistent warmth that seeped into the cracks of his broken life and began to thaw him from the inside. Her domain was the cabin. She moved through the small space with a quiet grace, her hands always busy, her presence a soft hum of domesticity that Luke hadn't realized he'd missed so acutely. The cabin began to change. A jar of wildflowers appeared on the table. The curtains, once gray with dust, were washed and hung, letting in a brighter, cleaner light. The scent of baking bread or simmering stew now greeted him at the door when he came in from the fields, a welcome so profound it sometimes made him stop on the threshold, overwhelmed. Clara was nesting, creating a sanctuary against the harshness of the world outside. Her language was one of care. It was in the way she folded his laundry, her touch lingering on the rough fabric of his shirts. It was in the mug of hot coffee she'd have ready for him on cold mornings, her fingers brushing his as she passed it to him. These were small, simple acts, the gestures of a wife, and they twisted Luke's heart with a confusing mix of gratitude and guilt. Their moments of intimacy were quieter than the ones in the barn, but no less powerful. They happened in the warm, fire-lit space of the kitchen, a world away from the wind and the dirt. One evening, he was cleaning a new rifle at the table while she was kneading dough. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of his cleaning rod and the soft thump of her hands working the dough. He watched her, mesmerized. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing slender, pale forearms dusted with flour. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a faint sheen of perspiration on her upper lip. She was beautiful, he realized with a jolt. Not in a stark, striking way like June, but with a soft, gentle beauty that promised comfort and peace. He nicked his finger on a sharp edge of the rifle's mechanism. A bright bead of blood welled up. It was nothing, a minor cut, but Clara was at his side in an instant. "Oh, Luke," she said, her voice filled with concern. She took his hand in hers, her touch incredibly soft against his calloused skin. Her fingers were cool and gentle as she examined the small wound. She dipped a corner of a clean cloth in the water basin and carefully dabbed the blood away. Her head was bent low, her hair brushing against his arm. He could smell the faint scent of flower and something floral, like rosewater. His entire being focused on the feeling of her small, soft hands holding his large, rough one. It was a simple, chaste touch, but it felt more intimate than any embrace. He could feel the frantic beating of his own heart, and he wondered if she could feel it too. She wrapped a small strip of cloth around his finger, her movements deft and sure. "There," she said, looking up at him, her blue eyes wide and earnest. "You must be more careful." They were so close he could see the tiny flecks of gold in her irises. The space between them crackled. He felt a powerful urge to lean in, to close the distance, to taste the flower on her lips. The feeling was so overwhelming, so unexpected, that it terrified him. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice hoarse. He stood up abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floorboards. "I need some air." He fled the cabin, escaping into the cold night, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stood under the vast, star-dusted sky, the guilt washing over him in a sickening wave. He was a man torn in two. He felt like the worst kind of sinner, a greedy, covetous man. He had buried his wife not 6 months ago, and here he was, alive with feelings for 2 different women. He needed June's strength, her partnership in the grueling work of survival. He felt a kinship with her, a bond forged in sweat and shared hardship. But he also craved Clara's softness, the gentle way she was coaxing his frozen heart back to life, reminding him of a comfort he thought he'd lost forever. One woman was the solid earth beneath his feet. The other was the warm hearth that kept the cold at bay. How could he live without either? The thought of choosing, of sending one of them away, was a physical pain, an amputation he couldn't bear to perform. They had both awakened him from the gray, numb twilight he'd been living in since Martha's death. They had brought color and warmth and life back to his world. And he was terrified of being plunged back into the darkness. He was a traitor to his wife's memory. He was a fraud to these 2 women who had placed their trust in him. He was a man caught in a trap of his own making, and he saw no way out. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Autumn was breathing down their necks, a reminder that another Wyoming winter was on its way. One evening, a sudden, unseasonal frost descended upon the ranch. The temperature plummeted, and the wind, which had been a whisper all day, rose to a mournful howl, rattling the window panes and finding every crack in the cabin walls. Luke built up the fire until it roared in the hearth, a blazing beacon against the encroaching cold. After a meager supper of stew and hard biscuits, they didn't disperse as they usually did. Luke to his chair, the women to their quiet tasks before ascending to the loft. Tonight, the cold kept them together. They drew their chairs close to the hearth, seeking its warmth. 3 solitary figures huddled in a small circle of light. The firelight danced on their faces, casting long, flickering shadows. The howling of the wind outside seemed to isolate them further, sealing them in their own small, fragile world. Luke retrieved a half-empty bottle of whiskey from the mantel. It was a rare indulgence, but the night seemed to call for it. "A little something to warm the bones," he said, his voice low. He poured a small amount into 3 tin cups. Clara accepted hers with a hesitant look, her delicate hands wrapping around the cup as if for warmth. June took hers with a steady hand, her eyes meeting Luke's over the rim of the cup. There was something in her gaze, a deep, knowing look that made him feel as though she could see right through him, right into the turbulent mess of his soul. For the first time, an awareness passed between all three of them, open and acknowledged. It wasn't just the cold that had drawn them together. It was the unspoken tension, the questions that had been hanging in the air for weeks. The whiskey was a catalyst, a permission slip to let the carefully constructed walls crumble. Just for a moment. They drank in silence for a while. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wail of the wind. The liquor spread a slow, pleasant warmth through Luke's chest. He felt the tight knot of guilt and confusion loosen its grip, just slightly. It was June who spoke first, her voice calm and even, but laced with a pain that was ancient. She stared into the flames as if seeing a memory replayed in the dancing light. "The night Samuel died," she began, her voice barely above the sound of the wind. "The surgeon had done all he could. The field hospital, it wasn't a hospital. It was a tent full of screaming men. It smelled of blood and fear." Her gaze was fixed, unseeing. The ball had shattered his hip. The infection set in. I knew. As a nurse, I knew there was no hope. But as a wife, I kept wiping his brow, giving him sips of water, pretending. She took a sip of whiskey, the firelight glinting in her eyes. "He died just before dawn. His hand was in mine. My apron, my hands, they were covered in his blood. When I finally came out of the tent, the sun was rising. His mother was there. She'd come down from the farm. She looked at me, at the blood on my apron, and she spat on the ground." June's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made the words all the more devastating. "You let him die," she said. "You were probably tending to other men while my boy was fading. A harlot in a white apron. That's what you are. No better than a camp follower." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of sympathy for the woman sitting across from her. June seemed not to notice. She just continued to stare into the fire. She told everyone I had been intimate with my patients, that I was unclean. That's the word she used. Unclean. And it stuck. They threw my things out of the house I'd shared with her son, the house I was supposed to live in for the rest of my life. She finally looked up, her gaze sweeping over Luke and then Clara. "I wasn't cast out for what I'd done. I was cast out for what I was. A woman who knew what was inside a man's body. A woman who wasn't afraid of blood." A heavy silence descended on the room, broken only by Clara's soft, choked sobs. She wasn't crying for herself, but for June. The raw injustice of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her own pain now brought to the surface. "They called me unclean, too," she whispered, her voice trembling. Luke looked at her, his heart aching. "It was after the baby." She couldn't bring herself to say more about that. "My family had already told me I was no longer welcome in their home. I had nowhere to go. I stayed in a small room at the boarding house. On Sunday, I don't know why. I went to church. I suppose I thought I could pray for forgiveness. For my baby's soul." Her voice broke. She took a ragged breath and continued. "I was sitting in the back pew. Reverend Miller, he stopped his sermon. He pointed right at me, a long, bony finger, and he said, 'There is a sinner in our midst, a fallen woman who has brought shame upon her family and upon this house of God.' The whole congregation turned to look at me. I could feel their eyes, like stones. He said I had broken God's covenant, that my body was a vessel of sin. He said I was defiled." She was crying freely now, the tears streaming down her face. But she didn't stop. The story poured out of her, a torrent of shame and humiliation held back for too long. "He told me to leave. He said I wasn't welcome in the house of the Lord until I had publicly repented for my fornication. 2 deacons came and they escorted me out. They didn't touch me. They acted as if touching me would stain them. They just walked on either side of me, all the way to the door. While everyone watched, I could hear them whispering, "Harlot, Jezebel." I felt so small, so filthy, as if my very soul was tarnished beyond repair. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The fire crackled and hissed. The wind howled its lonely song. Luke sat frozen in his chair, a silent witness to their twin crucifixions. He listened to the story of a woman punished for her compassion and another punished for her love. He heard the echoes of a cruel, unforgiving world, a world that used words like unclean and defiled to break the spirits of women who had already suffered unbearable loss. A fire of a different kind ignited in his chest, a cold, hard rage. A rage at June's mother-in-law, at Reverend Miller, at the families and the towns that had cast these women out. He said nothing. There were no words that could possibly be adequate. Instead, he reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and placed one hand on June's arm and the other on Clara's shoulder. He didn't speak. He just sat there, between them, his large, calloused hands offering a silent, solid testament. "I hear you. I see you. You are not unclean. You are not defiled. You are safe here." His hands, which had built a home and dug a grave, were now a bridge between two broken hearts. His fingers tightened, his knuckles white, a physical manifestation of the fury and compassion warring within him. In that moment, he wasn't their judge or their potential husband. He was their anchor in the storm, a silent guardian of their shared pain. And in the flickering firelight, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts and the uncertainty of their future, the three of them were no longer just strangers. They were survivors. The night of the shared confessions did not break the tension. It sanctified it. The space between Luke, June, and Clara was no longer just an awkward silence, but a shared vessel holding their collective pain. But the land had no patience for such fragile human dramas. As autumn deepened, Wyoming began to show its teeth. The sky, for weeks on end, was a sheet of hammered brass, offering blinding light but no rain. The brief promise of spring had been a lie, and the summer that followed had been a thief, stealing the moisture from the earth until the creek bed was a roadmap of cracked porcelain and the soil turned to a fine, choking dust. A relentless wind rose each afternoon, not a cooling breeze but a hot, abrasive rasp that scoured the land, peeled paint from the cabin, and worked its way into their eyes, their mouths, their very souls. The world shrank and hardened. The grass on the plains turned from green to gold, then to a brittle, lifeless brown. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like the hoops of a barrel, their lowing taking on a desperate, hollow note. Survival became a brutal arithmetic of rationing. Water, hauled bucket by bucket from a well that seemed to sink lower each day, was more precious than gold. Every sack of flour, every side of bacon was counted and measured. Their lives, once governed by the rising and setting of the sun, were now dictated by the unyielding realities of the drought. They worked as a single unit, their individual skills becoming essential parts of a desperate machine. Luke, his face a grim mask of worry, rode the perimeter of his land constantly, searching for any patch of surviving grass, chasing off the coyotes and wolves that grew bolder as the other game grew scarce. June worked beside him, her strength a match for his. She learned to read the tracks in the dust, to spot the shadow of a circling buzzard that meant trouble. She was tireless, her resilience a silent rebuke to the dying land around them. Clara, meanwhile, turned the cabin into a fortress of conservation. She found ways to make their dwindling supplies stretch, creating meals from next to nothing. She patched their worn clothes until they were a mosaic of fabrics, her needle and thread a tiny weapon against the encroaching poverty. They were no longer two women vying for the affection of one man. They were soldiers in a quiet, desperate war against the elements. And Luke was their unwilling captain. He saw their sacrifice, their grit, and it only deepened his internal conflict. Each evening, When they gathered, exhausted and coated in dust, he would look at their faces, June's smudged with dirt, but her eyes clear and resolute. Clara's pale with weariness, but her mouth set with a soft determination, and a feeling of profound, terrible responsibility would wash over him. He had brought them to this. His moment of lonely desperation had tethered them to this unforgiving place, to this life of hardship. And yet, he knew with a certainty that terrified him that their presence was the only thing keeping him from letting the wind and the dust swallow him whole. The calf was born to their scrawniest heifer, a small, trembling thing with big, dark eyes. In a good year, it would have been a sign of hope, a promise of the herd's future. In a drought, it was another mouth to feed, another fragile life to protect. 2 days after its birth, it vanished. Luke saw the heifer first, pacing and lowing frantically near a narrow, rocky ravine at the far edge of the property. The place was a treacherous scar on the land, a tangle of boulders and thorny scrub. He knew before he even looked. The calf had wandered and fallen in. He found it 20 feet down, wedged between 2 large rocks, its leg bent at a sickening angle. It was alive, bleeding weakly. Luke scrambled down the loose scree, his boots slipping, sending a shower of pebbles to the bottom. The space was tight, the air still and hot. He could see the calf's leg was badly broken. Worse, it was pinned by a large, flat rock that had shifted. "Easy now," he murmured, both to the calf and to himself. "We'll get you out of this." He put his shoulder to the rock and pushed. It was heavier than it looked, its weight dead and unyielding. He grunted, his muscles straining, the veins in his neck standing out. The rock shifted, just an inch, but it was enough. He pushed again, every fiber of his being focused on the single, desperate task. The rock scraped, groaned, and then with a final, agonizing heave, he moved it far enough to free the calf. It was then that he heard the rumble from above. His head snapped up. The vibrations of his struggle had loosened the unstable rocks of the ravine wall. He had a split second to see the cascade of stone and dirt, a small, localized landslide. Before it hit him, he threw himself over the calf, a purely instinctual act of protection. There was a sickening crack as a rock slammed into his left leg, and a bright, searing flash of pain behind his eyes as another glanced off his temple. Then, the world went dark. He came to, floating in a sea of pain. June's face was above him, a blurry image against the brassy sky. "Luke, Luke, can you hear me?" Her voice was tight with a control he could feel even through the fog in his head. He tried to sit up, and a wave of nausea and agony washed over him. His leg. He looked down. A shard of rock protruded from his thigh, and the denim of his trousers was soaked in a dark, spreading stain. "Don't move," she commanded. "Clara has gone for the wagon. We'll get you back to the cabin." He barely remembered the journey back. It was a jolting, agonizing blur, every bump of the wagon wheels sending a fresh wave of fire through his leg. He remembered Clara's face, pale and tear-streaked, and June's hands, impossibly strong, holding him steady. They got him inside, onto his bed. The cabin was a flurry of controlled panic. It was June who took charge, her past as a nurse rising to the surface, sharp and clear. "Clara, I need water, boiled, and all the clean cloth you can find, and that whiskey from the mantel." Her voice was the calm, authoritative voice of the field hospital, the voice of a woman who had seen far worse than this. Clara, her eyes wide with fear, flew to obey. June, meanwhile, took a knife from the kitchen and, with a single, steady slice, cut away the blood-soaked fabric of Luke's trousers. The wound was ugly, deep and ragged, with the sharp, white gleam of bone visible within. Luke gritted his teeth, a low groan escaping his lips. "I have to clean it, Luke," June said, her voice close to his ear. "And I have to set the bone. It's going to hurt." What followed was an eternity of precise, methodical torture. with Clara holding him down, her tears falling onto his chest. June cleaned the wound with whiskey and boiled water, her touch firm and efficient, wasting no motion. Luke felt the sting of the alcohol, the probing of her fingers, and he bit down on a strip of leather Clara had given him until his jaw ached. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, the pain a relentless tide. Through the haze, he was aware of June working over him. He saw the needle she'd taken from Martha's sewing basket, sterilized in the flame of a candle. He felt the sharp, repeated pricks as she stitched the torn flesh together, her movements quick and sure. When she was done, she began to work on the bone, her strong hands probing, positioning. He cried out, his voice a raw, animal sound, as she forced the bone back into place with a sickening grate. Then, she fashioned a splint from pieces of a broken crate and bound his leg tightly. By the time she was finished, sweat was pouring down her face. Her knuckles were white, and Luke was shivering, a fever already beginning to take hold. She bathed his face with a cool cloth, her movements now gentle. The next 2 days were lost to him, a fever dream of disjointed images and whispered voices. He was back in the ravine, the rocks falling. He was a boy again, running through his father's fields in Ohio. He was standing on the hill, shoveling cold earth onto Martha's coffin. The figures of June and Clara blurred at his bedside, 2 guardian angels in a private hell. They took turns feeding him broth, changing the damp cloths on his forehead, listening to his fevered ramblings. Sometime during the second night, he surfaced briefly from the delirium. The cabin was dark, save for a single candle burning on the table. June was sitting in the chair by his bed, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He felt a powerful surge of gratitude. She had saved him, her skill, her strength. He reached out, his hand clumsy, and found hers. Her skin was cool. She started, her head snapping up, her eyes wide in the dim light. Luke? He couldn't form the words he wanted to say. His tongue was thick, his mind still clouded. But he held on to her hand, a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. He looked at her, at this strong, capable woman who had seen so much death and had refused to let him become another casualty. "Don't leave," he rasped, the words torn from his throat. He pulled her hand closer, his grip surprisingly strong. He looked into her eyes, though he may have been seeing another's. He whispered a name, a single, broken word that was both a plea and a prayer. "Stay." He didn't know he said it. He slipped back into the fever's embrace, his grip on her hand finally going slack. But June remained frozen in her chair, his whispered word echoing in the silent cabin. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, followed by another and another. She didn't make a sound, but her body shook with silent, wrenching sobs. She cried for his pain, for Martha's memory, and for the impossible, heartbreaking complexity of her own place in this house. A few days later, the fever broke. Luke woke up weak and aching, but clear-headed for the first time since the accident. The pain in his leg was a dull, constant throb, but the fire in his blood was gone. The world slowly came back into focus. He was aware of the debt he owed the 2 women, a debt so immense he didn't know how he could ever repay it. He was weak, helpless. He couldn't even get out of bed on his own. Clara, in particular, took on the role of his caregiver with a quiet, fierce devotion. She fed him, read to him from an old copy of the Bible, and tended to his needs with a gentleness that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. About a week after the accident, the need for a proper bath became unavoidable. He was grimy with sweat and dirt, and the cabin was beginning to smell of sickness. "I can help you," Clara offered, her cheeks tinged with pink. "The bathhouse is warm. I've already heated the water." The small bathhouse, a shed-like structure behind the cabin, was filled with steam. The air was warm and humid, smelling of soap and hot water. It was a small, intensely private world. With Clara's help, Luke managed to hobble inside, his arm around her shoulder. His splinted leg held awkwardly out. He sat on a low bench, his body trembling with the effort. There was a moment of awkward silence. Then, with a quiet resolve, Clara began to help him undress. Her fingers were hesitant at first as she unbuttoned his shirt, but they grew steadier. She avoided his eyes. Focusing on the task, Luke sat passively, a fresh wave of shame washing over him at his own helplessness. She took a sponge and a bar of lye soap and began to wash him. Her touch was light, clinical at first, as she washed his arms, his chest, his back. He closed his eyes, his head leaning back against the rough wood of the wall. The feel of the warm water, of her gentle hands, was a balm to his aching body. But as she worked, the atmosphere in the small, steamy room began to change. The air grew thick, charged. Her movement slowed. Her hand, as she washed his chest, lingered for a moment over his heart. He could feel the slight tremor in her fingers. He opened his eyes. She was looking at him, her blue eyes dark and wide in the steam-softened light. The pretense of a clinical task had fallen away, leaving something else in its place, a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored his own. He saw the loneliness in her eyes, the deep, desperate need to be seen, to be held, to be wanted not for her sin or her shame, but for herself. And in that moment, his own carefully constructed walls, already weakened by pain and fever, crumbled into dust. The guilt, the grief for Martha, the confusion, it all receded, replaced by a hunger so profound, so elemental, that it shocked him. It was the hunger of a man who had been starved for a woman's touch, for the simple, life-affirming reality of another warm body next to his. He reached up and touched her cheek. Her skin was soft, damp with steam. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. He slid his hand around to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her damp hair, and gently pulled her toward him. Their lips met in a kiss that was not gentle. It was clumsy, urgent, a collision of loneliness and need. It tasted of soap and desperation. Her hands came up to frame his face, her body pressing against his. His own weakness was forgotten, consumed by a sudden, violent surge of life, of want. What happened next was a fever of a different kind. It was a hurried, frantic coming together in the warm, wet darkness of the bathhouse. It was not a joining of two people, but the desperate clinging of two halves of a whole, each hoping the other could make them forget they were broken. It was driven by pain and gratitude, by pity and a raw, physical hunger that had been denied for too long. It was as much an act of solace as it was of passion, a fierce, fleeting attempt to hold the darkness at bay. When it was over, they pulled apart, their breath coming in ragged gasps, and in the sudden, echoing silence, the reality of what they had done crashed down upon them. The steam in the air suddenly felt cold. The intimacy vanished, replaced by a stark, terrifying clarity. Luke looked at Clara's face, at her kiss-swollen lips and wide, shocked eyes, and a wave of pure, cold panic seized him. "What have I done?" The question screamed in his mind. He had betrayed Martha. He had taken advantage of this poor, lost girl. He had broken the fragile truce of their small, strange family. He pulled away from her, his movement so abrupt she stumbled back. "Clara," he started, his voice a hoarse croak, but he couldn't finish. He couldn't look at her. He felt soiled, a sinner in a way Reverend Miller could never have imagined. He dressed himself with fumbling, awkward movements, the pain in his leg a dull, forgotten ache compared to the sharp agony in his soul. He hobbled out of the bathhouse without another word, leaving her standing alone in the cooling, steam-filled room. The days that followed were a quiet, excruciating hell. Luke retreated into a fortress of silence. He avoided Clara's gaze. His answers to her questions were clipped, monosyllabic. He pushed himself back to work far too early, his face a mask of grim determination, using the physical pain in his leg to distract from the turmoil within. Clara, in turn, was a ghost of herself. She was hurt, confused, her brief moment of connection shattered by his rejection. She moved about the cabin with a heartbreaking quietness, her eyes constantly seeking his, pleading for an explanation he could not give. June saw it all. She watched the new, charged distance between them, the way Luke flinched from Clara's touch, the way Clara's eyes filled with tears when she thought no one was looking. She said nothing. Her silence was not one of ignorance, but of a deep, weary understanding. She continued her work, her expression unreadable, a steady, constant presence in a house that was fracturing from within. She was waiting. She knew a reckoning was coming. It came one night, a week later. The wind was howling again, a wild, lonely sound that scraped at the edges of the cabin. Luke lay on his bed, his leg propped on a pillow, staring into the darkness. He couldn't sleep. The image of Clara's face in the bathhouse was burned into his mind. He heard a soft footfall, and then a figure appeared at his bedside. It was Clara, her hair down, wearing a simple white nightgown. She looked like a wraith in the moonlight slanting through the window. "Luke?" she whispered. He didn't answer. She knelt by the bed, her voice a desperate, trembling plea. "Don't shut me out, please. What we did, it wasn't a mistake. I have feelings for you. Luke, I know you feel something for me, too." She reached out, placing her hand on his chest, a gesture of ownership, of claiming what she believed was hers. "You don't have to choose her. Choose me. Let me be your wife. I can make you happy." She leaned in, her intention clear, ready to use her body to remind him of their shared secret, to stake her claim and end the torturous uncertainty once and for all. At that moment, another shadow fell across them. Both of them looked up. June was standing in the doorway to the main room, a silhouette against the dying light of the hearth. She wasn't holding a lamp. She wasn't armed. There was no anger in her posture, no shock. She stood perfectly still, a figure of calm, quiet judgment. She looked at Clara, kneeling by the bed. She looked at Luke, frozen beneath her hand. Her gaze was steady, piercing, cutting through all the lies and evasions. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it filled the entire cabin, silencing even the howling of the wind. It was a simple question, but it held the weight of all their futures. "Have you decided, Luke?" He had no answer. He could only stare, trapped between the woman who was trying to claim him and the woman who was demanding a truth he did not possess. The three of them stood locked in a silent, impossible tableau, the wind screaming its answer for him out in the vast, empty darkness of the prairie. June's question hung in the dark cabin long after she had returned to the loft. "Have you decided, Luke?" It was a splinter under his skin, a question he had no answer for. The confrontation, instead of forcing a resolution, had shattered the fragile peace, leaving behind a landscape of jagged silences and averted eyes. Clara's desperate bid for certainty and June's quiet ultimatum had created a chasm between them all, and Luke stood in the middle, his feet on crumbling earth. But the land itself was making decisions for them. The drought held its grip, tightening like a fist. The sun rose each day not as a promise of life, but as a predator, baking the moisture from the air, from the soil, from their very bodies. The water in the well dropped until the bucket came up with more mud than water, scraping the bottom with a dry, hollow sound that echoed Luke's own emptiness. The last of the salted pork was gone. The flour barrel was a landscape of dusty valleys, and the jerky was as hard and unyielding as their circumstances. They were at the edge of starvation, a slow, quiet process that mirrored the dying of the land around them. There was no choice. The decision, for once, was not his to make, but was made for him by the brassy, unforgiving sky. "We're going to town," he announced one morning, his voice rough, He was standing on the porch, his newly healed legs stiff and aching in the cool dawn air. He had watched the sun rise, a merciless eye in the east, and knew they couldn't wait another day. "We need supplies. Whatever our credit is good for." Clara, who was sweeping the porch with a worn-out broom, stopped, her hands tightening on the handle. Town was a world of people, of judging eyes, a place that had already cast her out once. June, emerging from the barn with 2 buckets of sludgy water, merely paused. Her gaze meeting his, he saw no fear in her eyes, only a practical, grim acceptance. It was a thing that had to be done. The journey was a slow, funereal procession through a dead world. Luke drove the wagon, the 2 women sitting beside him on the hard wooden seat. The silence was a third passenger, heavy and oppressive. The horses' hooves kicked up plumes of fine, gray dust that coated their clothes, their faces, their lungs. The landscape was a monochrome canvas of brown and beige, the skeletal remains of bushes clawing at the air. The sun beat down, and the heat shimmered off the ground in waves, distorting the horizon until it looked as though the world itself was dissolving. After half a day's travel, the settlement of Redemption crept into view. It was a harsh, unlovely collection of unpainted wooden buildings huddled along a single dusty street, a necessary scar on the vast, empty plain. But to their parched eyes, it represented life. It meant water from a deep town well, barrels of flour, and the company of other human beings, a prospect that filled Luke with as much dread as relief. As they rolled down the main street, the town seemed to wake up and take notice. Faces appeared in windows. Men loafing on the porch of the saloon stopped their whittling and stared. Women, sweeping their own porches, paused to watch the wagon pass. Luke could feel their eyes on them, 100 tiny pinpricks of curiosity. He was known here. He was Luke Carson, the widower who kept to himself. The sight of him arriving with not 1, but 2 women, strangers, at that, was a spectacle. The whispers started before they even stopped the wagon. They were carried on the hot, dusty air, insidious and unavoidable. "Carson's got company. Heard he sent for a mail order. Looks like he got 2 for the price of 1. Luke's hands tightened on the reins, his knuckles turning white. He felt a hot, protective anger rise in his throat. He glanced at the women. June's face was a mask of indifference, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as if the whispers were nothing more than the buzzing of flies. But Clara was shrinking into herself, her shoulders hunched, her bonnet pulled low to hide her face. She was a delicate flower being subjected to a sandstorm, and she was already beginning to wilt. He pulled the wagon up in front of the General Mercantile, the largest building in town. "I'll handle this," he said, his voice a low growl. "You 2 wait here." But June was already climbing down from the wagon, her movements fluid and determined. "We need to stretch our legs, Luke, and we know what's needed as well as you do." Clara hesitated, but at a firm look from June, she followed, keeping her head down as she stepped onto the wooden boardwalk. The 3 of them entered the store together, a united, if silent, front. The store was a cavern of shadows and smells: coffee, leather, molasses, and dust. A woman with a face like a dried apple and sharp, bird-like eyes stood behind the counter. She was Mrs. Gable, the owner, a woman whose tongue was known to be as sharp as her prices. "Luke Carson," she said, her voice thin and reedy. She offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze flickered over June and Clara, cataloging them, judging them. "Been a long time. Heard you had a hard winter." Her eyes lingered on his splinted leg. "Looks like it was harder than most." "We need supplies, Martha," Luke said, cutting through the pleasantries. He handed her a list Clara had carefully prepared. "Mrs." Gable took the list, but her eyes were still on the women. "And who are your companions?" she asked. the word dripping with insinuation. Family, are they? They're staying with me, Luke said, his voice flat, a clear warning to drop the subject. But Mrs. Gable was not a woman to be deterred by a warning. She thrived on gossip the way a cactus thrives on drought. Well, isn't that charitable of you? Taking in strays, though it must be crowded. I remember your poor wife. God rest her soul. She was a good, God-fearing woman, kept a clean house. She paused, letting the implication hang in the dusty air. It's a lonely life out on the plains for a man alone. A man can get desperate. Luke took a step toward the counter, his fists clenched, but June laid a hand on his arm, a subtle pressure that was both a restraint and a reassurance. We need 2 sacks of flour, 20 pounds of salt pork, coffee, sugar, and beans, June said, her voice clear and steady, ignoring the woman's venom completely. Mrs. Gable's thin lips tightened. She turned her attention to Clara, who was trying to make herself invisible near a barrel of pickles. And you, dearie? You're a delicate-looking thing, not used to the hard life out here. I'd wager, where did Carson find you? Not from around these parts, I can tell. Clara flinched, unable to meet the woman's piercing gaze. Pennsylvania, ma'am, she whispered. Pennsylvania, Mrs. Gable exclaimed, as if it were a foreign country. A long way to come. Must have had a powerful reason to leave. We're simple folk out here. We value propriety. A woman's reputation is all she has. Her gaze raked over Clara's full figure, her meaning as sharp and ugly as a shard of glass. A man like Luke, a recent widower, he has to be careful. Folks talk. He wouldn't want people thinking he'd taken up with damaged goods. The word struck Clara like a physical blow. A choked sob escaped her lips. Her face, already pale, turned ashen. All the shame she had tried to leave behind in Pennsylvania had followed her here, to this dusty store in the middle of nowhere. It was a brand she could never escape. Something inside June snapped. The stoic calm she had maintained shattered. Before Luke could move, she had rounded the counter. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scream. Her movement was swift, economical, and terrifying in its controlled fury. She grabbed Mrs. Gable's wrist, her grip like a steel trap. You will be silent, June said, her voice a low, menacing hiss. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened in shock and pain, her face turning a mottled red. You know nothing of this woman's life. You know nothing of her heart. You are a mean, bitter woman, and you will not speak to her that way again. Let go of me, Mrs. Gable shrieked, trying to pull her wrist away. This is an outrage. But June held fast. For a split second, Luke saw the nurse from the battlefield, the woman who had faced down death and despair, and was utterly unafraid of this vicious, small-minded shopkeeper. The commotion had drawn the attention of the men outside. They crowded in the doorway, their eyes wide with a mixture of amusement and shock. The scene had become a public spectacle. For Clara, it was the final, unbearable humiliation. With another sob, she turned and fled. She pushed through the gawking men in the doorway and ran out into the blinding sunlight of the street, her hands covering her face. June released Mrs. Gable's wrist with a final, contemptuous shove. Get our supplies, she ordered Luke, her voice shaking with rage. Then she, too, was gone, striding out of the store after Clara. Luke stood frozen for a moment, the stares of the townsfolk burning into him. He threw a few gold coins on the counter, more than enough to cover the supplies. Get it ready, he snarled at the sputtering Mrs. Gable. I'll be back for it. He stormed out of the store. He saw Clara huddled at the far end of the boardwalk, her body shaking with sobs, and he saw June, standing beside her, not touching her, but shielding her from the curious eyes of the town with her own body. A silent, defiant guardian. And in that moment, Luke saw something he had never seen before. He saw June, who had every reason to see Clara as her rival, protecting her with a ferocity that was breathtaking. He saw them united, not by him, not by their shared circumstance, but by a deeper, more profound bond. It was the bond of the outcast, the judged, the condemned. It was the fierce, unspoken loyalty of two women who knew what it felt like to be branded unclean by a world that didn't have the courage to look at its own sins. He saw, with a sudden, painful clarity, that their story was no longer about him. It wasn't about his ranch, his loneliness, or his impossible choice. It was about them, about the family they were forging in the crucible of their shared pain. And he was just a witness to it. The realization was both humbling and liberating. The ride back was even more silent than the ride in, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of tension and resentment. It was the silence of shared trauma, a fragile, protective cocoon around the three of them. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the sky in the west began to bruise, turning from brass to a dark, angry purple. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange, electric energy. A low rumble echoed in the distance. "Storm's coming," Luke said, his voice quiet. He urged the horses on, hoping to outrun it, but he knew it was a fool's errand. The land was thirsty, and the sky was about to give it a violent, long-denied drink. The first drops of rain were fat and heavy, hitting the dusty ground with a series of dark, spreading splotches. Then, the heavens opened. A torrential downpour descended upon them, a solid, blinding sheet of water that turned the world to a gray blur. The wind rose to a howl, driving the rain sideways. Within minutes, they were soaked to the bone, shivering in the sudden, dramatic drop in temperature. The dusty track dissolved into a river of mud, the wagon wheels sinking and sliding. "There!" June shouted over the roar of the storm, pointing. "A line shack." Through the deluge, Luke saw it. A small, dilapidated cabin, barely more than a shed, hunkered down in a small copse of stunted trees. It was an abandoned shelter for ranch hands who worked the cattle lines, likely unused for years. It was their only hope. He steered the struggling horses off the track, and they half slid, half stumbled their way to the relative shelter of the trees. He unhitched the horses, tethering them on the leeward side of the shack, and then the three of them burst through the flimsy door, escaping the fury of the storm. Inside, it was dark and cold, smelling of mildew, old wood, and rat droppings, but it was dry. The roof, miraculously, was mostly intact. A crude stone fireplace stood against one wall, and a single, rickety bunk was built into the other. There was nothing else. Shivering, their teeth chattering, they stood dripping in the center of the small room. The roar of the rain on the tin roof was deafening. They were trapped, isolated from the world, in a space so small they could not avoid touching. Luke, acting on instinct, went to the fireplace. He found a small pile of dry kindling left by the last occupant, tucked away in a recess. With numb fingers, he managed to strike a match and coax a tiny flame to life. He slowly fed it bigger pieces of wood he broke from the bunk frame, and soon a small, cheerful fire was crackling in the hearth, pushing back the cold and the darkness. The firelight cast flickering, dancing shadows on their faces. They huddled close to its warmth, their wet clothes clinging to them. The need to get out of their sodden garments was a practical necessity. But in the charged, intimate space, it felt like something more. It was Luke who acted first. He turned his back to them and shucked off his wet shirt and trousers, leaving him in his long underwear. He passed his shirt to June. "Here," he said, his voice low. "It's drier than yours." A silent understanding passed between them. Modesty was a luxury they could not afford. One by one, with averted eyes and hesitant movements, they stripped off their wet outer layers. Clara, her hands trembling, passed her dress to Luke, who hung it on a nail near the fire to dry. June did the same. They were left in their shifts and undergarments, their forms softened and made vulnerable by the firelight. June found a single moth-eaten horse blanket on the bunk, and they wrapped it around their collective shoulders, huddling together for warmth, a strange, shivering trinity. The storm raged outside. The fire crackled inside. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a world stripped down to its barest essentials. 3 bodies, a fire, and a storm. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She was looking at June. "In the store, I was a coward. I ran—" "You were not a coward," June said, her voice firm but gentle. "You were hurt. There's no shame in that." She paused, her gaze on the flames. "I shouldn't have put my hands on her. I couldn't stand the look on her face, the way she said those things to you. It was the same look my mother-in-law gave me." "She called us damaged goods," Clara murmured, the words like poison on her tongue. "Maybe she's right. We are. We're both broken." Luke felt a pang in his chest. He looked at them, their faces etched with a pain he was only just beginning to understand. The blanket was a thin barrier, and he could feel the trembling of Clara's body, the steady, solid warmth of June's. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You're not broken." He looked from one to the other, his gaze holding them. "You're survivors." And in that moment, in that cold, abandoned shack, with the storm trying to tear the world apart outside, the last of the secrets began to fall away. It was not just their clothes that were being stripped away, but their armor, the roles they had been playing, the rival, the caregiver, the judge, dissolved in the heat of the fire. Clara, her face wet with tears, shifted under the blanket and leaned her head against Luke's shoulder. It was not a gesture of seduction, but of pure, unadulterated exhaustion and need. He stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, his arm coming around her instinctively, pulling her closer into the circle of warmth. Then he felt another shift. June, who always kept her distance, leaned in from the other side, her head coming to rest against his other shoulder. Her body was tense at first, then it, too, relaxed, surrendering to the simple, human need for comfort. He sat there, between them, a living anchor for their pain. He could feel the frantic, bird-like flutter of Clara's heart and the slow, steady beat of June's. He smelled the scent of rain and wet wool and wood smoke and the unique, clean scent of their skin. No one spoke. Words were useless now. They were beyond the world of rules and reputations, of shame and judgment. This was something older, more primal. This was the simple, profound truth of 3 lonely, battered souls finding a sanctuary in each other. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head and pressed a kiss to the top of Clara's hair. Then, he turned to the other side and did the same to June. They were not kisses of passion, but of reverence, of acceptance, of apology for a world that had been so cruel to them. Clara looked up, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. June lifted her head, her own eyes luminous in the firelight, filled with a deep, weary understanding. A silent pact was made in that look, a recognition that what they had, the 3 of them, was something that had no name, no precedent, no place in the world outside this shack, but it was real. They shifted again, turning toward each other, their bodies fitting together under the rough blanket. It was a tangle of arms and legs, of damp skin and shared breath. It was a joining born not of desire, but of a desperate, mutual need for solace. It was an embrace that offered absolution. Here, in the heart of the storm, they were not a widower and 2 mail-order brides. They were not rivals or choices. They were simply a family, a strange, broken, beautiful family, holding each other together as the world fell apart. And for the first time, in the warm, fire-lit darkness, they were whole, The journey back from the line shack was made in a world washed clean. The rain had broken the drought's fevered grip, leaving the air tasting sweet and the earth smelling of life. The sky was a soft, forgiving blue, and the parched land seemed to sigh in relief. Something had broken inside the three of them, too. The storm had washed away the last of the unspoken resentments, the jealousies, and the fears. They returned not to the fractured, tense cabin they had left, but to a home. A new kind of life began on the Carson Ranch, one governed by an unspoken treaty of the heart. There were no titles, no clear definitions for what they were to one another, but their roles settled into a natural, easy rhythm. They were a three-stranded cord, each strand distinct, but braided together to create something far stronger than its individual parts. The nights were no longer a source of tension. The single bed in the main room and the loft above became fluid spaces, their sleeping arrangements dictated by a simple, unspoken need for closeness, a silent rotation of comfort and shared warmth that erased the lines of ownership and possession. June, with her innate knowledge of the earth, found a small, sun-drenched patch of ground near the cabin and began to cultivate a garden. But she did not plant beans or squash. She planted herbs, yarrow and comfrey, chamomile and willow bark, plants she remembered from her nursing days, remedies for fever and pain and troubled sleep. Her garden became a place of healing, and soon, word spread. A neighboring rancher's wife, her child burning with fever, came to their door, hesitant and desperate. June gave her a tincture of willow bark and a bundle of dried chamomile, and the fever broke. June had found a new way to be a nurse, not in a bloody tent, but here, under the wide Wyoming sky, her hands in the dirt, coaxing life and solace from the soil. Clara, in turn, found her own calling. She had seen the children on the neighboring ranches, their faces streaked with dirt, their eyes bright with an untutored intelligence. They were growing up as wild as the land, with no prospect of education. She cleaned out the small, unused tack room in the barn, fashioned benches from old planks, and using a piece of slate and a lump of chalk, she started a school. At first, only 2 children came, shy and wary. But Clara's gentleness was a language they understood. She taught them their letters, their numbers, how to read from the pages of her worn Bible. Soon, more children arrived, their laughter filling the once silent ranch, a sound as life-affirming as the rain. She was no longer the shamed teacher from Pennsylvania. She was Miss Clara, a beacon of kindness and knowledge in a land that had little of either. Luke watched it all, a quiet, profound sense of wonder unfolding within him. He saw his ranch, once a monument to his grief, transformed into a place of healing and learning. He saw these 2 women, cast out by the world, become the very heart of a new, growing community. He worked his land with a renewed purpose, the ache in his leg a constant reminder of the price of survival and the gift of his rescue. The hollow space inside him, carved out by Martha's death, was still there, but it was no longer an empty void. It was a space that had been filled with a love so unexpected, so unconventional, that it defied all logic. He would watch them in the evenings, June tending her herbs, Clara reading by the fire, and a feeling would wash over him, so fierce and protective that it was a physical ache in his chest. This was his family. It had been forged in pain and secrecy, but it was more real, more true, than anything he had ever known. This quiet, fragile peace lasted through the golden autumn and into the first snows of winter. It was a cold day in late November when the outside world came knocking. He was a man named Abernathy, a land inspector from the territorial office in Cheyenne. He rode a fine horse and wore a dark wool coat and a bowler hat, all of which looked ridiculously out of place against the snow-dusted landscape of the ranch. He was a man made of straight lines and sharp angles, his face impassive, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He carried a leather satchel filled with papers and the cold, unyielding weight of the law. He accepted a cup of coffee but refused a seat by the fire, preferring to stand in the center of the room, an official presence that immediately made the cozy cabin feel small and inadequate. Mr. Carson, he began, his voice as crisp as the air outside. I'm here on a routine inspection regarding your claim under the Homestead Act. The government grants this land on the condition that it is settled and improved. But there are other conditions. Clauses pertaining to the moral character of the claimant. Luke stood opposite him, his hands resting on the back of a chair, a silent warning in his posture. June and Clara, who had been mending clothes by the fire, fell still, their needles frozen in mid-stitch. Abernathy cleared his throat, pulling a document from his satchel. It has come to the attention of the Territorial Office, through reports from the town of Redemption, that your domestic situation is irregular. He did not look at the women, yet his words were aimed squarely at them. The law is quite clear. Mr. Carson, a man may have one wife. The Homestead Act is designed to encourage the formation of proper, God-fearing families, to bring civilization to these wild lands. It is not intended to sanction arrangements that violate the principles of public decency and Christian morality. The man's words were a cold, legalistic translation of Mrs. Gable's vicious gossip. They hung in the air, sterile and ugly, a judgment from a world that had no understanding of the life they had built here. You are currently living with 2 unmarried women, Abernathy continued, his tone flat. This is considered a violation of the morality clause. As such, the government has the right to revoke your claim. You would forfeit the land and all improvements upon it. Luke's knuckles were white where he gripped the chair. The injustice of it was a hot, metallic taste in his mouth. This land, which he had worked and bled for, which he had buried his wife in, could be taken away because of the narrow-minded bigotry of his neighbors. However, Abernathy said, placing a document and a pen on the table, the office is prepared to be lenient. We are not unreasonable men. We understand that life on the frontier can be complicated. He finally glanced at June and Clara, his expression one of faint distaste. You must rectify the situation. You will choose one of these women, and a marriage license will be issued. The other woman must vacate the property immediately. Once you are legally and properly married, and your household is in moral order, the complaint will be dismissed, and your claim will be secured. He pushed the paper forward. It was a simple affidavit, a legal document declaring Luke's intent to marry. There was a blank space for the bride's name. You have until my departure tomorrow morning to sign. Abernathy said, choose a wife, Mr. Carson, or lose your home. The law requires it. He seemed to expect an argument, a plea. He got none. Luke looked from the cold, official document to the faces of the 2 women he loved. He saw the fear in Clara's wide eyes, the defiant stillness in June's posture. He saw the life they had built, the healing they had fostered, the love that had bloomed in this barren place, and he felt no hesitation. He looked back at the inspector, his gaze as hard and unyielding as the winter ground. No, he said. The single word dropped into the silence of the room, heavy and final. Abernathy blinked, taken aback. Mr. Carson, perhaps you misunderstand the gravity of the situation. I understand it perfectly, Luke said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You're telling me to throw one of these women out, like a sack of unwanted grain, so I can keep a piece of dirt. The answer is no. I won't sign it. You would lose everything? Abernathy asked, incredulous. Luke's gaze did not waver. I'm not the one who's about to lose everything. Abernathy, seeing the absolute resolve in Luke's face, snapped his satchel shut. Very well. Be it on your own head. I will file my report in the morning. He gave a curt nod and left. The cold blast of air from the open door a final punctuation to his visit. The 3 of them stood in the silence his departure left behind. The threat was no longer a whisper from town. It was a legal certainty. They would lose it all. The cabin, the barn, the fields, the grave site on the hill, June's garden, Clara's school. Everything. That night, an unspoken grief settled over the cabin. They moved about their evening chores with a heavy slowness, each lost in their own thoughts. After their meager supper, Luke went out to the barn, needing to be alone. The weight of his decision, of their impending loss, pressed down on him. He had not hesitated, but the consequences were devastating. He had saved his family only to make them homeless. Inside the cabin, June and Clara sat by the fire. The document Abernathy had left behind, sitting on the table between them like a death sentence. "He shouldn't lose his home because of us," Clara said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It's not right. It's all my fault. If I had never come." "It is not your fault, Clara," June said, her voice firm. "It is the fault of a world that is too small and too cruel to understand." She looked at the document, at the blank space where a name was supposed to be. "But he is right. Luke cannot lose this land. He has poured his life into it. Martha is buried here." A terrible, heartbreaking understanding passed between them. They had become a family, a true and loving family. But the world only had room for two. "I will go," June said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I am the older one, the stronger one. I can make my own way." "No," Clara immediately countered, her voice rising with a strength June had never heard from her before. "You can't. You belong here. Your garden. The people who need you. This is your home. I should be the one to go. I'm the one who brought the most shame. I am damaged goods. Remember?" She said the words with a bitter, painful irony. "Don't you ever say that," June said fiercely. "That is a lie you will not carry." They sat in a painful impasse, each willing to sacrifice herself for the other. For the man they both loved, they were trapped by their own love, a love that was now the instrument of their destruction. Then, Clara's gaze fell on the pen and inkwell sitting on the mantelpiece. An idea began to form in her mind, a desperate, wild, and beautiful idea. What if we both wrote to them?" she whispered, her eyes shining with a sudden, feverish light. June looked at her, confused. "Wrote to them? What would we say?" "We tell them the truth," Clara said, leaning forward, her voice filled with a newfound passion. "Not Mrs. Gable's truth or Mr. Abernathy's truth, our truth. We confess. We tell them that this is our choice, that we love him, and we love each other, and we have chosen to live this way, that we are not coerced or held here against our will. We are not victims. We are a family." June stared at her, the audacity of the plan dawning on her. It was an act of profound rebellion. Instead of accepting the world's judgment, they would preempt it with a declaration of their own. They would use the government's own tools, the written, official word, to state a truth the government could not comprehend. "They won't listen," June said, the practical side of her warring with the hope in Clara's eyes. "Maybe not," Clara admitted. "But they will have to read the words. They will have to know that we are not ashamed. What do we have to lose now?" She was right. They had nothing left to lose. Later that night, long after they thought Luke was asleep, they sat at the table, their heads bent close together in the flickering lamplight. They each took a piece of paper. Clara wrote with a flowing, heartfelt script, her pen scratching softly in the quiet room. "To the Sirs of the Territorial Office, I am writing to you in the matter of Mr. Luke Carson. You believe him to be a man of low morals, but I must tell you he is the kindest, most honorable man I have ever known. He took me in when my own family cast me out. The world sees me as a fallen woman, but he has only ever treated me with respect. I am not his captive. I live on his ranch by my own free will, as does June Abernathy. We are not rivals. We are sisters in a way the law cannot understand. We love him, and he has given us a home where we have found not shame, but healing and a purpose. If you must punish someone, punish me for my love, but do not take this good man's home." June's letter was shorter, her handwriting stark and clear. each word hammered onto the page. Gentlemen, my name is June Abernathy. I am a war widow and a nurse. I came to Mr. Carson's ranch seeking a home and have found one. I am here by choice. I am not a victim. I am a partner in this life. Clara Bishop is my family. Luke Carson is the man I choose to stand by. The arrangement in this house is one of mutual love, respect, and survival. It is more moral than any law you can write on a piece of paper. Do what you must. They signed their names, their hands trembling slightly, and sealed the letters. 2 small acts of defiance against an entire world. Luke had not been asleep. He had been lying in the darkness, listening to the murmur of their voices, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He had heard their initial argument, each offering to sacrifice herself, and the pain of it had been a physical blow. Then, he'd heard the scratching of their pens. He didn't know what they were writing, but he knew it was for him. He could bear it no longer. He rose from his bed, his splinted leg making no sound on the packed earth floor. He entered the main room just as they were sealing the letters. They looked up, their faces pale and startled in the lamplight, like 2 conspirators caught in the act. He didn't speak. He walked slowly, painfully, to the table and looked down at the 2 letters addressed to the territorial office. He looked at their faces, at the tear tracks on Clara's cheeks and the fierce, protective light in June's eyes, and he finally understood the depth of their love, for him and for each other. They were not just willing to sacrifice themselves, they were willing to stand and fight in the only way they knew how. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled his knees washed over him. All the pride, all the stoic silence that had defined his life, crumbled away, in a movement that was utterly alien to him, a gesture of complete and total surrender. He sank to his knees on the floor before them. He reached out and took one of their hands in each of his, holding them tightly. He looked up at them, his eyes, for the first time since they had met him, swimming with tears. "I heard you," he said, his voice thick and broken. "I heard you both, willing to leave." He shook his head, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "This land, this house, it's just dirt and wood. It's nothing. Without you, it's a grave. You are my home. Both of you." He squeezed their hands, his gaze moving from one to the other, a silent vow passing between them. "If I have to leave this land to keep you both, I will," he said, the words a sacred oath whispered in the dead of night. "If we have to walk away from here tomorrow with nothing but the clothes on our backs, we will do it together. I am not choosing. I am not signing any paper but the one we write ourselves. My choice is you." He was no longer their protector, their captain. He was theirs, completely and utterly. He was kneeling at the altar of the family they had created, a family that obeyed no law but love. Clara began to cry, not tears of sadness, but of a profound, soul-shaking relief. June's own eyes glistened, her tough exterior finally melting away to reveal the vulnerable, loving heart beneath. They slid from their chairs and knelt with him on the floor, the 3 of them forming a tight, desperate circle. They clung to each other, their bodies shaking with the force of their shared emotion. The last walls between them had not just been breached, they had been obliterated. There, on the cold floor of the cabin, with the threat of exile hanging over them, they found their true sanctuary. It wasn't the land, it wasn't the house. It was here, in this embrace. They sealed their vow not with ink or with law, but with tears and with touch, a sacred silent contract of 3 hearts bound together, ready to face whatever came next, as long as they could face it together. The morning after Abernathy's departure dawned cold and brittle, the inspector's final, damning words seemed to have frozen the very air in the cabin. Yet, the night of their shared vow had changed everything. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of their stomachs, but it was no longer a solitary burden. It was a weight they now carried together. There was no discussion. After a silent breakfast, Luke harnessed the horses to the wagon. He took the 2 sealed letters from the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at June, then at Clara. Their faces were pale in the thin morning light, but their eyes were steady. They had made their stand. Now, they would face the consequences. He climbed onto the wagon seat, placed the letters in the inside pocket of his coat, and with a nod that was both a farewell and a promise, he drove off toward redemption, leaving the 2 women standing side by side on the porch, watching until he was just a speck against the vast, white landscape. He did not know what to expect in town. He was prepared for hostility, for the cold shoulders and muttered insults. But something had shifted. The story of the confrontation in Mrs. Gable's store had spread, but it had been twisted by the strange alchemy of frontier gossip. June's fierce defense of Clara had not been seen as an outrage, but as an act of formidable loyalty. Luke's quiet refusal to be cowed by the town's matriarch had been interpreted as strength. They were no longer just a scandalous curiosity. They were an enigma, a puzzle the simple townsfolk didn't quite know how to solve. They were outsiders? Yes, but they were outsiders who stood together, and on the frontier. That kind of solidarity commanded a grudging respect. He mailed the letters at the post office, the clerk barely meeting his eyes. He bought the few supplies he could afford and left without speaking to another soul. The ride home was long and cold. The future an unknown, terrifying country. Winter descended in earnest, burying the ranch in a deep, soundless blanket of white. The threat from Cheyenne was a constant, unspoken presence, a shadow in the corner of every room, every approaching rider. Every gust of wind that sounded like a horse's whinny sent a jolt of anxiety through them. They were living on borrowed time, expecting the arrival of an official notice, a man with a badge and a deed that was no longer theirs, telling them to leave. But the notice never came. Weeks bled into months. The snow deepened, isolating them, forcing them inward. And in that enforced intimacy, their strange, nameless family truly took root. They learned the landscape of each other's souls. They learned the meaning of each other's silences, the fears behind a fleeting frown, the joy in a quiet smile. They worked to prepare for a future they might not even have on this land. Luke taught June how to track in the snow. Clara taught Luke how to read the finer print in her Bible. June taught Clara which frozen roots could be boiled into a nourishing soup. The community that had once judged them began, slowly and hesitantly, to depend on them. When the Blevins boy came down with a croup that threatened to steal his breath, his father rode through a blizzard to the Carson ranch. June met him at the door, her face calm, and gave him a poultice of mullein and a syrup of horehound that eased the boy's coughing and saw him through the night, when the winter boredom and isolation began to fray the nerves of the scattered families. Clara sent messages with a traveling trapper, inviting the children to the cabin for stories and lessons. Her small school became a vital link, a place of warmth and light in the darkest part of the year. They were no longer defined by the world's judgment. They were defined by what they gave to the small, harsh world around them. Spring arrived, and with it, a kind of answer. It didn't come in an official envelope. It came in the form of Jedediah Smith, a neighboring rancher, who stopped by on his way back from Cheyenne. He was a laconic man of few words, but what he said changed everything. He sat at their table, sipping Clara's coffee, and spoke of the goings-on in the territorial capital. "Heard a funny thing," he said, looking at Luke. "That land inspector, Abernathy, was in the saloon, complaining. Said he'd run into the most stubborn homesteader in all of Wyoming, a man who'd rather lose his land than choose between his 2 women." "Luke, June," and Clara froze, their eyes fixed on Jedediah's face. Jedediah took another sip of coffee. "Seems the letters you sent caused quite a stir. Abernathy said he'd never seen the like. 2 women, writing in bold as brass, confessing to the whole arrangement. Said they were there by choice." He shook his head, a slow, wondering smile touching his lips. Abernathy told the land commissioner he didn't know what to do. The law said one thing, but here were two signed, sealed testimonies saying another. He said he wasn't about to ride out to some godforsaken ranch and try to physically remove a woman who had, in writing, declared her right to be there, especially when her man was standing right beside her. He looked around the cabin, at the neat rows of drying herbs, at the children's slates stacked in the corner, at the palpable sense of peace in the room. "Folks in Cheyenne are calling you the man with 2 wives." The commissioner apparently said that as long as there were no further complaints, and as long as the land was being improved, he had bigger problems to deal with than a man who had somehow managed to build a home that was well defended. He finished his coffee and stood to leave. "Seems to me," he said, pausing at the door, "that the government has decided it's easier to just leave you be. Nobody wants to tangle with a man who has 2 women willing to fight for him." And that was it. There was no formal pardon, no official dismissal. The law had not bent. It had simply looked the other way. They had not won by fighting the system, but by being something the system had no category for, no box to tick. They had won by being themselves. 1 year later, the sun was a benevolent eye now, not a predator. It warmed the fields where a healthy herd of cattle grazed, their numbers growing. It shone down on a ranch that was no longer just a place of survival, but a thriving, vibrant homestead, the acknowledged center of their small, scattered community. June's garden had expanded. It was a riot of green, dotted with the bright colors of calendula and echinacea flowers. A small, sturdy shed had been built beside it, the walls lined with shelves of neatly labeled jars containing tinctures, salves, and dried herbs. This was her clinic. The women from the surrounding ranches no longer came in desperation, but with a quiet trust. They came for remedies for their children's ailments, for teas to soothe their own weary bodies, for the calm, competent presence of the woman they now called Mama June. She was a healer, and in healing others, she had healed the deepest parts of herself. The shame of being called unclean was a distant, meaningless echo from a life that no longer belonged to her. The laughter of children was a constant music on the ranch. The old tack room was now a proper 1-room schoolhouse, with a real blackboard Luke had bought in Cheyenne and benches for 10 students. Clara stood before them, her face glowing, no longer the timid, broken girl who had arrived clutching her bag like a shield. She was a figure of authority and profound kindness. She taught reading and arithmetic, but she also taught compassion. She was a mender of spirits as much as a teacher of minds. The children adored her, following her like a flock of ducklings. To them, she was not a fallen woman. She was Mama Clara, the woman who had opened up the world to them through the magic of words. Luke was the quiet, steady center of this world. He was a rancher, his hands still calloused, his face still etched by the sun and the wind, but the deep, abiding grief in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful contentment. He was the guardian of this strange and beautiful creation, the man who worked from sunup to sundown to ensure that this sanctuary they had built would endure. He was no longer a man torn in two, but a man made whole by a love that defied definition. The sun was setting, bleeding a brilliant, fiery crimson across the vast expanse of the prairie sky. A small fire crackled in the stone pit in front of the cabin, its warmth a welcome comfort in the cooling evening air. Luke sat on a log, and on either side of him, pressed close, were June and Clara. The day's work was done. The last of Clara's students had been sent home. The last of June's patients had been tended to. This was their time. In Luke's hands was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was the first thing he had ever made that was not purely practical, a gift he had crafted for them over the long winter. Inside it, they kept their history. They kept their letters. "Which one first?" he asked, his voice a low, comfortable rumble. Clara smiled, her head resting on his shoulder. "The one that started it all." Luke reached into the box and pulled out a creased, stained piece of paper. It was his application to the mail-order bride service. He unfolded it carefully and, in the flickering firelight, he began to read aloud. Name, Luke Carson. Age, 35. Widower, no. He paused, a sad, fleeting shadow crossing his face. Temperament, sober. Hard-working. Requirements for a wife. Strong constitution, willing to work, honest. When he finished, he refolded the paper. He looked at the two women beside him. I was a fool, he said softly. I was asking for a worker, a body to fill the silence. I had no idea I was asking for a heart. For two, June reached into the box next and pulled out a letter of her own, one she had never sent. Her voice was steady as she read, To Samuel, my dearest husband, I hope you have found peace where you are. For a long time, I had none. I lived with your ghost and the ghost of the woman I used to be. But I want you to know, I am at peace now. I have a home. I have a garden where I can heal people, as I tried to heal you. And I have found a new family, a new love. It is not a love that replaces you, but one that has made a space beside you in my heart. I am happy. Samuel, I hope you can be happy for me. Then it was Clara's turn. Her letter, too, had never been mailed. It was addressed to the parents who had disowned her. Her voice did not tremble as she read. To my dearest mother and father, I do not write this letter seeking your forgiveness, for I have finally learned that I have nothing to be forgiven for. I loved and I lost, and my heart was broken. But it was not tarnished. I write to tell you that I have found a home in the last place on earth you would ever look for one. I have a family that was not born of blood, but of shared pain and a stubborn, defiant love. I am a mother to children who are not my own, but who have healed the part of me that died with my baby girl. I am loved for who I am, not for who you wanted me to be. I am not your fallen daughter anymore. I am just Clara, and I am finally free. Lastly, Luke pulled out the two letters they had sent to Cheyenne. He read them both, his voice filled with pride. They were not just letters. They were declarations of independence, the founding documents of their small, strange nation. When he was done, they sat in a comfortable silence, watching the embers of the fire glow against the deepening twilight. The letters were a testament to the long, hard road they had traveled, from desperation and shame to a love that had redeemed them all. Later that night, the fire had died down to a soft, pulsing orange. The moon had risen, a perfect silver disk in a sky littered with diamond dust stars. The world was vast and silent. Inside the cabin, they lay together, a tangle of limbs and shared breath under a single quilt. There were no titles here, no husband, no wives. There were no rules, no laws, no judgments. There was only the solid, warm reality of their bodies, the slow, steady beat of three hearts in unison, and a profound, quiet peace. They were not a household in moral order, by the world's standards. They had no clear and proper name, but as they lay together under the watchful, silent moon, they were, in every way that mattered, a family. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm curious, where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect. Please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this one. And don't forget to share your thoughts. Your reflections are a cherished part of this journey.